The Edo period of Japan, 1603 to 1868, was a time of sustained peace, cultural refinement, and introspection. During these tranquil centuries, under Tokugawa rule, two interwoven arts flourished: the art of the Zen garden and the ritual of the tea ceremony. Both of these traditions, nurtured by Zen Buddhist philosophy and aesthetic principles, became emblematic of Japan's meditative cultural spirit. In an era defined by stability and order, feudal lords, samurai, monks, and townspeople alike found solace and meaning in the dry landscape gardens, kare-sansui, of Zen temples, and in the choreographed grace of the tea ceremony, Chanoyu. These practices were not merely pastimes or decorations. They embodied a way of life that prized harmony, simplicity, and inner tranquility. In what follows, we explore the historical, cultural, artistic, and philosophical dimensions of Edo-Period Zen gardens and tea ceremonies. The tone is calm and reflective, mirroring the subject matter itself. We will see how Zen gardens, often called Zen rock gardens in the West, use arrangements of rocks, gravel, moss, and minimal vegetation to evoke the essence of nature and provide a focus for meditation. We will also delve into the Japanese tea ceremony, known as sado or chado, the way of tea, a highly refined practice of preparing and sharing a bowl of powdered green tea in a specialized setting. This ritual, elevated to an art form in the 16th century and embraced widely during the Edo period, integrates Zen principles into every gesture and object, from the rustic tea hut and its garden path to the pottery, utensils, and movements of host and guest. Both the Zen garden and the tea ceremony exemplify the Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, an aesthetic of rustic simplicity and quiet elegance that acknowledges impermanence and imperfection as sources of beauty. In the context of Edo period Japan, these practices were not isolated hobbies, but key threads in the fabric of social and spiritual life. Samurai warlords, seeking refinement and discipline in times of peace, practiced tea as a means of self-cultivation and diplomacy. Monks and laypersons tending dry gardens found in the act of raking gravel or placing stones a wordless Zen teaching. An old saying from this tradition holds that Zen and tea have the same taste, suggesting that the silent contemplation one finds in a garden is akin to the enlightenment sought in a bowl of tea. In this script, written in straightforward yet evocative language, we will journey through these serene gardens and tea rooms of Edo, Japan. We will consider their history and evolution, their design and aesthetic principles, and the deep philosophy that underlies their form. It is a journey into an oasis of calm in a bygone era, an exploration of how the Japanese of the Edo period cultivated inner peace and profound beauty in meticulously raked sand and a simple shared cup of tea. The atmosphere throughout remains contemplative and informative, inviting us to slow down and reflect, much as a visitor might pause on a stepping stone in a dew-drenched tea garden, or a monk might gaze over an arrangement of rocks at dawn. Edo period, an era of peace and cultural flourishing. Edo period Japan, governed by the Tokugawa shoguns from 1603 to 1868, was characterized by an unprecedented peace known as the Pax Tokugawa. After centuries of feudal warfare, the unification of the country under Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors brought stability and order. The samurai warrior class settled into bureaucratic and administrative roles and the strict social hierarchy of the time, with samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants delineated by class, created a structured society. Within this ordered world, the arts bloomed. Cultural pursuits became a way for the elite to cultivate the mind and spirit, and for the emerging urban merchant class to express refinement, despite their lower formal status. In this climate, practices like the tea ceremony and garden design were highly valued as expressions of ethical and aesthetic ideals. The Tokugawa government promoted Neo-Confucian ethics to solidify social harmony, yet Zen Buddhism also thrived as a spiritual undercurrent. Many samurai lords, daimyo, and even shoguns themselves were drawn to Zen practices and arts. They saw in Zen-influenced arts a means to discipline the mind and cultivate virtues like restraint, focus, and respect. For example, the shogunate encouraged tea gatherings as a form of elite education and diplomatic etiquette, believing that training in the way of tea instilled good manners, self-control, and an appreciation of beauty in warriors. By the mid-Edo period, hosting a tea ceremony had become an important social ritual in samurai circles, a controlled yet cordial setting where political relationships could be managed and where the spirit of harmony was displayed. The World Green Tea Association notes that during the Tokugawa era, tea ceremonies were held which were hosted by the shogun and invited daimyo. Chanoyu became very important social and political opportunities for daimyo. In essence, the tea room served as a microcosm of orderly society where every participant knew their role and behaved with utmost decorum. At the same time, Edo society saw a gradual broadening of cultural participation. The merchant class, chonin, though ranked at the bottom of the social order, grew wealthy and influential in cities like Edo, today's Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto. With economic prosperity and leisure time, merchants became patrons and practitioners of the arts as well. They took lessons in tea ceremony from established masters or from the new tea schools that emerged in Edo-Period, and they designed quaint courtyard gardens, tsuboniwa, in their townhouses to emulate the tranquil aesthetics enjoyed by the elite. By the 18th and 19th centuries, one could find small inner gardens tucked behind urban shophouses, complete with stepping stones, a lantern, and a basin, a tiny tea garden oasis in the bustling city. These little gardens brought a hint of nature and Zen calm into daily urban life, demonstrating how deeply the Zen garden aesthetic had permeated the culture. Overall, the Edo era's peace and isolation, due to the Sakoku policy that largely closed Japan to foreign influence, allowed indigenous arts to mature in distinctive ways. Patronage for architecture, gardens, painting, poetry, tea ceremony, flower arranging, and theater, like No and Kabuki, was strong. Artisans and masters in each discipline refined classical styles and codified rules and teachings for their art. It was during this time that many of the ways, the formal paths of training in an art, such as Seido, tea ceremony, Keido, flower arranging, and Shodo, calligraphy, reached a high point of systematization. The meditative and disciplined nature of these arts aligned well with the ideals of both Zen Buddhism and the samurai code of self-mastery. Indeed, it became common to regard artistic practice as a form of spiritual training. The tea ceremony, for instance, was described not just as an aesthetic pastime, but as a spiritual and aesthetic discipline for refinement of the self, a phrase echoed by tea schools and practitioners. Similarly, tending a garden or appreciating its scenery was seen as cultivating one's inner sense of harmony. Within this rich cultural tapestry, Zen gardens and the tea ceremony stood out as quintessentially Edo-period arts, at once highly formalized and deeply contemplative. They were interrelated in many ways and often experienced together. One would stroll through a quiet garden to reach a tea room, and the same sensibilities of seasonality and simplicity informed both environments. To better understand their significance, we turn first to the influence of Zen philosophy that underpins both practices, then explore each tradition in detail before finally reflecting on their shared principles and legacy. Zen Buddhism's influence on Edo-period aesthetics. Zen Buddhism, particularly the Rinzai Zen sect, had a profound impact on Japanese culture from the medieval period onward, and its influence continued through the Edo period. Zen emphasizes direct experience and the potential for sudden enlightenment, satori, through meditation and disciplined practice. By the Edo era, Zen teachings of simplicity, focus, and inner emptiness had become deeply ingrained in the arts. Zen priests often advised or collaborated with artists, tea masters, and garden designers, integrating spiritual meaning into these creations. The result was a flourishing of what may be called Zen arts, endeavors that serve as vehicles for mindful attention and insight. One of Zen's core tenets is the value of emptiness, or the void, kyu in Japanese. Rather than seeing emptiness as a lack, Zen views it as a space of potential and clarity, the open mind ready to perceive truth. In artistic terms, this translated to a celebration of minimalism and negative space. We see this in the Zen garden, where open expanses of raked gravel can symbolize the ocean or the void itself. The careful avoidance of clutter allows the mind to wander freely and contemplate deeper meanings. A well-known observation by scholar D.T. Suzuki notes that the Zen garden creates the atmosphere of emptiness, where one can let the mind drift, paraphrasing his sentiment on the meditative quality of these gardens. In tea ceremony as well, the sparsely furnished tea room, typically a small space with plain walls, a single hanging scroll, and only the essential utensils, gives a feeling of simplicity and stillness, focusing attention on the act of tea itself. The silence during key parts of the ceremony further accentuates this sense of calm space, much like silence is integral to Zen meditation sessions. Zen Buddhism also taught the appreciation of nature's transient beauty and the insufficiency of material excess. Many Japanese arts during Edo took on a sabi or wabi quality under Zen influence, celebrating the weathered, the imperfect, and the humble. The concept of wabi, chabi, originally implying the loneliness of living in nature, away from society, evolved under Zen and tea culture to signify a positive aesthetic of rustic simplicity and subdued refinement. Sabi, jibi, literally to be desolate or aged, complemented wabi as an appreciation for patina and the deepening beauty that comes with time and wear. Together, wabi-sabi became a key aesthetic ideal in the tea ceremony and related arts during the late 16th and Edo periods. As one tea master in modern times put it, the foundation of the way of tea is based on the aesthetic of wabi. Wabi is a state of mind. It is not merely enjoying old or rustic things, but cultivating an inner condition of contentment with simplicity. Zen training also values mindfulness, complete presence and attention in each moment. The phrase Zen and tea have the same taste became popular to express the idea that participating fully in a tea ceremony can be as enlightening as sitting in Zen meditation. This saying originates from the recognition that the way of tea, chado, is essentially Zen practice in the form of making and drinking tea. Every gesture, from ladling water to bowing to a guest, is to be carried out with total concentration and purity of intention. Samurai who studied Zen Buddhism applied these principles to their daily activities and to arts like tea. We can imagine an Edo-Period tea gathering where the host, possibly a practiced Zen adherent, moves with deliberate calm, treating the act of whisking tea as a form of moving meditation. The guests, in turn, sit silently and attentively, as if in a meditative state, savoring not just the taste of the tea, but the entire atmosphere, the light filtering through shoji screens, the sound of the iron kettle simmering, the feel of the pottery bowl in hand. In that shared silence, host and guests experience a glimpse of Zen mindfulness, a wordless understanding that aligns with Zen's emphasis on direct, non-conceptual experience. Zen Buddhism's influence is also evident in the appreciation of nature's symbolism and the idea of the microcosm. Zen art often uses natural elements to hint at larger cosmic truths. For instance, Zen poems and ink paintings might use a single autumn leaf to evoke the entire cycle of seasons, or a gnarled plum tree to suggest resilience and rebirth. This sensibility informed garden design in that gardens were seen as encapsulated landscapes, miniature universes where each stone or plant could carry layered meaning. A boulder might represent a mythical mountain. A bed of raked white gravel might represent the ocean or the emptiness of the sky. Importantly, these representations were not meant to be literal, but to stimulate the viewer's imagination and insight. Zen teaching prefers suggestion over explicit statement, a principle called yugen, yushuan, or mystery and depth. The dry Zen garden is an ideal stage for yugen. Its sparse elements invite contemplation, and the more one looks, the more one sees with the mind's eye. As Lafcadio Hearn, a later observer of Japanese culture, famously wrote, "One must learn to feel that stones have character, tones, and values in order to grasp a Japanese garden's beauty." This is a very Zen idea, to truly see the profound in what appears simple or mundane. In Edo, Japan, patrons of Zen gardens and tea gatherings were often well versed in Zen literature and poetry and would appreciate these subtleties. Lastly, Zen's impact can be seen in the egalitarian spirit that seeped into these arts. While Edo society was rigidly stratified, the tea room provided a rarefied environment where, in principle, worldly status was checked at the door. Sen no Rikyu, the great tea master of the 1500s, whose legacy deeply influenced Edo-Period tea, had insisted that all guests crawl through a small entrance, Nijiriguchi, to enter a tea hut, forcing even a lord to bow and symbolically putting everyone on the same level. This ethos was rooted in Zen's disregard for titles and its focus on one's inner quality. In an oft-cited anecdote, when the military ruler Toyotomi Hideyoshi attended a tea gathering with Rikyu, he had to remove his sword and stoop low to pass through the teeny door, a humbling act that reminded all present of the Buddhist teaching of removing ego and status in pursuit of truth. Such stories were passed down through tea circles in Edo times, reinforcing the notion that in the eyes of Zen and in the tea room, one's spirit matters more than one's rank. In sum, Zen Buddhism provided Edo-Period Japan with a philosophical framework that valued simplicity over extravagance, experience over theory, and spirit over form. The Zen garden and tea ceremony were two of the most sublime expressions of these values. With Zen as a guide, the designers of gardens and the masters of tea created spaces and rituals that were Satori made visible, enlightenment rendered in gravel, stone, steam, and tea. With this understanding of Zen's role, we can now examine the Zen garden and the tea ceremony each in detail as they manifested during the peaceful Edo era. Zen gardens in the Edo period. Japanese Zen gardens, karasan-sui, or dry landscape gardens, are perhaps the most austere and contemplative form of garden design in Japan. They rely on arrangements of rock, gravel, sand, moss, and occasionally a few low plants to evoke natural scenery in a highly abstract way. Typically enclosed by earthen walls or buildings, these gardens are meant to be viewed from a particular vantage point, often the veranda of a temple's abbot quarters, hojo, rather than walked through. In their pure form, Zen rock gardens contain no open water and few, if any, blooming flowers. Instead, raked white gravel symbolizes water or empty space, and carefully placed stones stand in for mountains, islands, or other features. The design is minimalist, yet each element is imbued with meaning and deliberately positioned. Edo-period Zen gardens inherited this tradition from earlier centuries, continued to maintain famous old gardens, and occasionally created new ones, all while the broader garden fashions of the time evolved in parallel. Origins and legacy. The classic Zen gardens were largely a product of the Muromachi period, 1336 to 1573, when Zen Buddhism enjoyed the patronage of the shoguns and warlords in Kyoto. Iconic sites like Ryoan-ji, Daitoku-ji, and Tenryuji in Kyoto were designed or refined in the 14th to 16th centuries by Zen monk gardeners such as Muso Soseki, also known as Muso Kokushi. By the Edo period, these famous temple gardens had become timeless models of the karasan-sui style. They were carefully preserved by the monks and often visited by learned travelers or officials. In fact, many original Zen gardens survived into Edo times and still survive today. Ryoan-ji's acclaimed dry rock garden, for instance, built in the late 1400s, continued to entrance observers with its 15 mysterious stones set in rippling sand. Edo period records and paintings indicate that these gardens looked much the same then as now and were regarded as important cultural treasures. We can imagine an Edo-era monk in early morning, slowly raking the gravel into perfect patterns around the stone groupings at Ryoan-ji, maintaining the same contemplative routine passed down over generations. The garden, in turn, served as a silent teacher to each new wave of temple residents and visitors. During the Edo period, garden design in general took a different turn for the ruling class. The daimyo lords developed a taste for large-scale, strolling gardens with ponds, artificial hills, and winding paths, elaborate landscape gardens meant for recreation and impressing guests. These stroll gardens, such as the famous Kenroku-in in Kanazawa or Koraku-in in Okayama, were lush and expansive, showcasing the wealth and power of their owners with a variety of scenic views and imported trees. They often included pavilions and tea houses for enjoying the scenery or taking tea. In contrast to the minimalism of the Zen garden, Edo's promenade gardens were maximalist, seeking to recreate entire landscapes and famous scenes within the garden's compass. However, the influence of Zen gardens did not disappear. Many stroll gardens incorporated dry garden sections or rock arrangements inspired by the Karasansui style, blending the new with the old. Large dramatic rocks that had been prized in earlier Zen temple gardens were also coveted by Edo landscapers for their promenade gardens. Moreover, stroll gardens frequently had rustic tea garden corners for tea ceremonies, which by necessity were designed in the simple, subdued manner of Zen gardens. More on tea gardens later. So while the grand aesthetic of Edo-period feudal lords leaned toward scale and drama, the spirit of Zen gardening persisted quietly within those estates and at the Zen temples that continued their tradition. Zen gardens continued to exist at Zen temples just as they had for centuries, providing tranquil spaces for meditation even as fashion elsewhere shifted. A historical note in one source observes that during the Edo period, the large promenade garden became the dominant style, but Zen gardens continued to exist at Zen temples. A few small new rock gardens were built, usually as part of a garden where a real stream or pond was not practical. In other words, new dry gardens were sometimes created in locations with limited space or water, for instance in sub-temples or urban settings, showing that Karasansui was still considered a viable design solution and aesthetic in Edo times. Design elements and symbolism. A typical Zen garden of the Edo period retained the canonical elements developed earlier. Stones, rishi, are the heart of the composition. They come in various suggested shapes: tall vertical, low horizontal, arching, reclining, each category with subtle symbolic connotations, such as a tall vertical stone suggesting a mountain peak or a guardian figure. In Zen garden manuals, stones were given names like Shumisen Ishi, Mount Sumeru stone, representing the sacred mountain at the center of the Buddhist cosmos, or Sanzon Seki, 3 Buddha stones, a triad of stones symbolically arranged to represent Buddha and 2 attendants. Even when not explicitly theological, each stone is selected and placed for its personality or expressiveness. As Lafcadio Hearn noted, every stone is chosen with a view to its particular expressiveness of form. Stones have character. Indeed, the art of rock placement, ishigumi, was a highly respected skill. An Edo period gardener or monk would study how to balance the number of vertical and horizontal stones in a grouping, how to create a pleasing asymmetry, and how to lead the eye naturally across the scene. Late in the Edo period, garden designers even introduced a concept of suteishi, or discarded stones, seemingly random, unarranged rocks placed to break up an overly refined look and give an impression of natural spontaneity. This was an interesting development. After generations of carefully orchestrated compositions, there was a recognition that a hint of chaos or namelessness could actually enhance the garden's natural feel, aligning with Zen's comfort with imperfection. Gravel or sand is the other signature element. Typically, fine pale gravel, often granite or quartzite, is spread in flat areas and raked into patterns. These patterns can be straight lines, wavy ripples, concentric circles, or more complex curves, often arranged around the stones as if the rocks were islands in a sea. In a Zen context, white gravel traditionally signifies purity, a notion inherited from Shinto, where white sand around shrines marks sacred ground. In the dry garden, gravel can represent water in a landscape, oceans, rivers, waterfalls, but it also embodies the idea of emptiness, the open space that defines forms around it. Monks in Edo times raked their gardens daily, not only to maintain the designs, but as a meditative practice. The act of raking is done in measured, even strokes, which requires concentration and a steady rhythm of breath, very much like a form of Zen mindfulness training. It is said that creating the saman, ripple patterns, in sand is akin to a painter making brush strokes. It's a creative exercise that reflects the state of one's mind. Early in the morning, before visitors might be admitted, a Zen temple's novices or gardeners would quietly rake the entire garden, erasing the previous day's marks and starting anew, much as one might sweep the mind clean each day. The resulting scene, when viewed, offers the harmony of various patterns, stones, and plants, which plays a role in appreciation, and the process of studying the sand patterns is similar to Zen Buddhist practice, often performed in silence at dawn by the priests themselves. Thus, the garden is both an object of meditation and a product of meditative labor. Plants are minimal in a Zen garden, but those that are used carry meaning. You might find a patch of soft green moss around the base of stones, or in the shade. Moss thrives in the humid Japanese climate and adds a sense of age and calm. There is a famous example at Saihoji, the moss temple, where over centuries, moss gradually colonized a once mostly gravel garden, transforming it into a verdant carpet that is now treasured. Moss in Zen symbolism can represent the passage of time and the tranquility of a place. Undisturbed, Edo-Period gardens, especially in Kyoto, often allowed some moss to grow, and temple gardeners knew the different varieties by heart. As one source notes, one of the plants essential to karasansui is moss, and Japan has hundreds of moss species, their colors subtly changing with seasons and moisture. Aside from moss, you might see a few evergreen shrubs or ground cover plants at the fringes of a dry garden to frame the scene or hide a fence base. Deciduous plants were rarely part of the composition, since falling leaves could disturb the clean gravel and require extra maintenance, although a picturesque pine or maple might be positioned outside the wall so its branches lean into the view. Borrowed scenery, shake, incorporating background mountains or trees into the garden's composition, was a technique used in many Japanese gardens, including Zen ones, to give a sense of depth and connection to the wider landscape. For example, at Tenryuji Temple, the garden uses the distant Arashiyama Hills as a natural backdrop, creating the illusion that the garden extends seamlessly into nature. Edo-Period viewers were keenly aware of this device and appreciated how a humble, walled garden could thus evoke the grandeur of nature beyond. Purpose and experience. The primary purpose of a Zen garden is to serve as an aid for meditation and reflection. Unlike stroll gardens or flower gardens, One does not enter the raked field of a karasansui. It is meant to be contemplated, often from a specific angle. The act of contemplation itself is a kind of discipline. One sits quietly, eyes softly focused on the arrangement, allowing thoughts to settle. A well-known anecdote involves the stone arrangement at Ryoanji. There are 15 stones, but it is said that from any viewing angle, only 14 are visible. One stone is always hidden by others. Only by attaining enlightenment, the legend goes, could one perceive that 15th stone in entirety. This playful assertion conveys the idea that perfection, seeing all stones at once, is elusive and perhaps only achievable through a shift in consciousness, a Zen wink at the viewer. Whether or not Edo-era monks promoted that specific story, the sentiment is reflective of Zen teaching. Reality is partly obscured and must be intuited rather than directly seen. Guests, including cultured samurai or poets who visited such gardens in Edo, times often wrote of their impressions in diaries and literature. They described the gardens in poetic terms, likening the rocks to islands in a sea of silver or to tigers crossing a sea, a common interpretation for certain temple gardens. These layers of metaphor show how a Zen garden engages the imagination. It is at once a physical composition and a prompt for an inner journey. Zen gardens in the Edo period might also have served a more quotidian but still spiritual function for the monks, a place to ritually walk or chant around if the design allowed a perimeter path and a means to instill a sense of order. Some Zen abbots gave lessons to their novice monks using the garden as illustration. They might point to the still water implied by the raked gravel and compare it to the quiet mind, or use the act of pruning a tiny tree in the garden as a metaphor for pruning one's attachments. Everything in the garden was a potential metaphor for Zen wisdom. The warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi, prior to the Edo period, once famously participated in a ceremony at which a great Zen garden was unveiled. He was initially disappointed by its apparent simplicity, just sand and stones, but later moved when he understood the profound restraint it symbolized. That story set a precedent that by Edo times, appreciation of such abstraction was seen as a mark of sophistication and inner cultivation. Notable Edo period Zen gardens. While many of the archetypal Zen gardens predated Edo, the period did see some creations and renovations worth noting. Kobori Enshu, 1579 to 1647, a polymath artist and tea master of early Edo, is credited with designing or redesigning several gardens that blend the dry garden concept with elegance. For example, Enshu created the garden of Konchi-in, a sub-temple of Nanzen-ji in Kyoto, which includes a celebrated karasansui arrangement. He also worked on Raikyu-ji, a temple garden in Bichu, now Okayama Prefecture, which features picturesque rock groupings and gravel areas alongside clipped azaleas, a harmony of Zen austerity with a touch of daimyo flair. Enshu was known for his aesthetic termed kirei sabi, beautiful serenity, or clean wabi, which modernized the wabi style with a bit more polish and decorative sense. In his gardens, one senses a refinement that appealed to the samurai of the day while still honoring the Zen roots. His contributions show how dry garden elements were adapted to suit the taste of Edo aristocracy, sometimes incorporating a more garden-esque look with more greenery or ornament, while retaining the essence of rock and gravel composition. Another development of the Edo period was the proliferation of smaller karasansui gardens in sub-temples and even in secular settings, like the homes of intellectuals. As Zen continued to be culturally prestigious, some Confucian scholars or literati, who were not monks but admired Chinese-influenced aesthetics, built their own interpretation of Zen gardens. An example is the hermitage of Ishikawa Jozan, 1583 to 1672, called Shisendo in Kyoto. Jozan was a scholar, not a monk, but his retreat features a serene dry garden with raked sand and artfully placed stones. Such spaces indicate that appreciation for Zen gardens widened beyond monastic use. The standard design was simplified and civilianized in some cases, but the essential idea of a quiet composition for contemplation remained. Even in Edo, the city, some temples of different sects, or the residences of doctors and scholars, incorporated courtyard rock gardens, showing a cross-pollination of the style. It's also important to mention the category of small inner gardens called tsubuniwa that became popular in Edo towns. While not all were Zen gardens, some were influenced by the dry style. These tsuboniwa were tiny courtyard gardens in machiya, townhouses, often just a few square meters in area. Many featured a stone lantern, a water basin, stepping stones, and evergreen plants, arranged in what is described as the Chaniwa, tea garden style, which overlaps with Zen aesthetics. They were usually meant to be viewed through a window or from a corridor, not entered, much like a miniature Zen garden one peeks at for a moment of repose. During Edo, merchants created these green pockets to bring a bit of Zen-like nature into their confined urban lives. This trend demonstrates that the visual language of Zen gardens, stones, gravel, lanterns, moss, had become a lingua franca of tranquility for many people, not just monks or samurai. In some, Zen gardens in the Edo period continued to serve their timeless function, providing a sanctuary of stillness and contemplation in a world that outside the garden walls was changing and bustling. They bridged the human and the natural, the temporal and the timeless. Whether in a grand temple or a modest courtyard, a patch of raked sand with a few stones could create a profound sense of peace. These gardens encapsulated Zen Buddhist philosophy in physical form, demonstrating how, by reducing nature to its essence, one could reflect on the essence of mind and existence. Their continued presence and subtle evolution in Edo times speak to the enduring Japanese belief that tending to nature's symbols is a way of tending to the soul. As we leave the dry gardens behind, we carry this quiet mood with us along the stone path to the next section, where water in a kettle will replace metaphorical water in gravel. We enter the realm of the tea ceremony. The Japanese tea ceremony in the Edo period. In the stillness of a Zen garden, one often finds a small stepping stone path leading to a rustic gate. Beyond that gate lies another sacred space of Edo, Japan, the tea garden and tea house, where the way of tea is practiced. The Japanese tea ceremony, or Chanoyu, Chanotang, is a ritualized preparation and drinking of powdered green tea, matcha. By the Edo period, Chanoyu had evolved into a highly codified art, blending aesthetic, social, and spiritual elements. It was during the Azuchi Momoyama period, late 1500s, just before Edo, that the tea ceremony was famously perfected by Sen no Rikyu, but it was in the Edo era that his legacy spread widely, and the practice became ingrained in the culture. The Edo period tea ceremony can be characterized by two broad developments: the formalization of schools of tea, with Iamoto family heads overseeing instruction, and the incorporation of Chanoyu into samurai and urban life as an essential cultural accomplishment. Legacy of Sen no Rikyu and evolution into Edo. Sen no Rikyu, 1522 to 1591, is a towering figure in the history of Chanoyu. Living in the war-torn 16th century, he served the warlords Oda Nobunaga and later Toyotomi Hideyoshi as a tea master and advisor. Rikyu espoused a tea practice rooted in wabi principles, favoring simplicity, naturalness, and the humble beauty of the imperfect. He introduced small thatched tea huts with tiny entrances to induce humility, rustic raku tea bowls with uneven shapes, and the concept that the tea gathering is a once-in-a-lifetime moment to be cherished, ichigo ichi. Rikyu's tragic death, ordered to commit suicide by Hideyoshi in 1591, occurred just before the Edo shogunate rose, but his influence was carried into the Edo era by his family and disciples. His descendants, particularly his grandson Sen Sotan, 1578 to 1658, kept the wabi-cha flame alive in Kyoto. Sotan's own sons went on to establish the three main Sen schools of tea in the early Edo period: Omotesenke, Urasenke, and Mushakuji-senke, each headed by the Sen family lineage. These schools formalized Rikyu's teachings and created a structured curriculum and certification system for teaching Chanoyu to others. This gave rise to the Iamoto system, wherein each school's Grand Master, Iamoto, had authority over licensure and standards of practice. By mid-Edo, if one wished to study tea ceremony, one typically did so under one of these schools, or one of several offshoots or regional schools, ensuring that Rikyu's spirit, albeit interpreted slightly differently by each school, permeated tea culture widely. Meanwhile, some of Rikyu's other direct disciples branched out in their own directions. Notably, Furuta Oribe, 1544 to 1615, a samurai and artist, and Kobori Enshu, 1579 to 1647, whom we met earlier as a garden designer, were both tea masters who forged new styles suited to the emerging Edo sensibilities. Oribe, a student of Rikyu, became tea master to the shogun Tokugawa Hidetada, the second Tokugawa shogun, and developed a distinctive aesthetic often called Oribe-ryu or Oribe-gonomi. He was known for a bold, sometimes eccentric taste, asymmetrical shapes, novel glazes in ceramics. The famous green copper glaze Oribe ware is named after him, and a playful incorporation of contrast and surprise in tea gatherings. Oribe's style still honored wabi simplicity, but injected a dose of creativity and personal expression. It is sometimes summarized as a stylish wabi with a twist. After Oribe, Kobori Enshu, who learned tea under Oribe, took a more elegant approach that looked back to classical courtly aesthetics and also aligned with the refined ethos of the Tokugawa piece. Enshu's style, kire-sabi, can be translated as beautiful loneliness or polished simplicity. He introduced a certain grace and cleanliness to tea settings. Slightly larger tea rooms for comfort, harmonious and well-proportioned gardens, and an emphasis on fine but subtle craftsmanship. Enshu served as tea instructor to the third shogun, Tokugawa Iemitsu, even designing tea houses within the shogun's castle compounds. This patronage indicates how Chanoyu had been wholeheartedly adopted by the highest authorities of Edo. Under Oribe and Enshu, a variant tradition known as warrior tea, bukesado, or daimyo tea, daimyo cha, emerged, catering to the samurai class's preferences and social protocols. For instance, one practical adjustment was that samurai would wear their long swords to the edge of the tea area. Enshu's school taught placing the silk fukusa, cloth for purifying utensils, on the right side of the obi sash, so it wouldn't interfere with a sword on the left hip. A small but telling example of how tea ceremony was adapted to warrior life. Despite these variations, all these streams, the Sen family, Wabi tea, and the Oribe/Enshu warrior tea, were grounded in the fundamental principles laid down by earlier masters. The four central virtues of Chanoyu, often recited in Edo times, were those Rikyu had emphasized: harmony, hei, weiwa, respect, jing, kei, purity, ching, sei, and tranquility, ji, jeku. Tea practitioners in the Edo period strove to embody these principles in each gathering. Harmony referred to a fitting together of all elements. The host, guests, utensils, food, and setting should all complement each other and the season. Respect meant the sincere honoring of everyone present and of the objects and space, a genuine humility and gratitude. Purity was both physical, cleanliness of the utensils, the tea room, one's hands and heart, and spiritual, a mindset free of worldly dust. Tranquility, the final goal, was the inner peace that arises naturally when the other three are achieved. It is said to be the ultimate state of the tea experience. These principles were more than slogans. They were taught as practical guidelines. For example, before a tea ceremony, the host would meticulously clean the tea room and garden, symbolizing purification, and perhaps display a scroll with a zen saying to set a tranquil mood. Guests would enter quietly, bowing to the alcove and the host, showing respect. Conversation would be polite and limited, so as not to break the harmony of silence. Each movement, such as the host rinsing the tea bowl or folding the cloth, would be performed with precision and grace, reflecting both harmony and purity of action. In a well-executed Edo-period tea gathering, these virtues could be almost tangibly felt by participants, leaving a lingering sense of calm and goodwill. The tea house and roji, or dewy path garden, the physical setting for Chanoyu in Edo times, was carefully designed to facilitate the proper atmosphere. Tea could be served in various contexts, even within a grand castle hall if needed. But the ideal was the dedicated tea house, chashitsu, often a small freestanding hut in a garden, detached from mundane living quarters. These tea houses were built in the Sukiya-zukuri style, an architectural style that had become dominant by the Edo period. Sukiya-zukuri is sometimes translated as the abode of refined leisure, or architecture of the cultivated taste, and it was characterized by a deliberate rusticity and use of natural materials. A classic Edo period tea house might have mud walls, a thatched or shingled roof, bamboo lattice windows, and a nijiraguchi crawl door as mentioned. The interior would be just one or two tatami mats in size. The famed tie-in tea room, attributed to Rikyu, was 2 tatami, very tiny, or sometimes 4.5 mats for a slightly larger gathering. The ceiling could be low, with exposed beams, and the only decoration would be the tokonoma alcove, where a hanging scroll, often Zen calligraphy or an ink painting, and a seasonal flower arrangement, chabana, were placed. By keeping the room sparse, attention focused on the few objects and on the gestures of host and guest. An observer in Edo described a well-built tea hut as akin to a mountain hermit's hut, deliberately looking as if a recluse scholar or monk lived there, even if it was owned by an urban merchant. This was part of wabi aesthetics, the simulation of poverty or simplicity to invite a contemplative mood. Approaching the tea house was an experience unto itself. The tea garden path, or roji, ludi, dewy ground, formed the crucial transition from the everyday world to the sacred space of tea. Senno Rikyu had poetic verses about the roji, one of which reads, "Since the path of this life is true but once, why not conduct ourselves as if entering a garden's dew?" Paraphrased. The idea is that as one walks through the tea garden, one should symbolically wash away the dust of the world and purify one's heart. In Edo-Period, roji design became somewhat standardized, and manuals and diagrams circulated that showed the ideal layout. Typically, there was an outer garden, soto roji, and an inner garden, uchi roji, separated by a simple gate, chumon. In the outer garden might be a waiting bench for guests to sit if they arrived early, and a modest toilet, sechen. A stone water basin called tsukubai, accompanied by a small stone lantern, was placed in the inner garden for ritual washing of hands and rinsing of mouth before entering the tea room. The term tsukubai means to crouch. One must bend or crouch to use the low basin, again fostering humility. The tsukubai ensemble was an Edo innovation and perfected by tea masters. A famous one is at the Kodaiji Temple in Kyoto, inscribed with Zen characters implying self-sufficiency and respect. In an Edo tea garden, lanterns provided subtle illumination in early morning or evening gatherings, casting gentle light on stepping stones and guiding guests safely. The stepping stones, Tsubushi Tobi Ishi, themselves were placed irregularly to slow one's pace. You literally have to watch your step, which prevents hurried mindlessness. Often, in the inner garden, stepping stones led to a small roofed shelter, koshikake machiai, where guests might sit and wait while the host made final preparations. Then, at a signal, perhaps the host lightly tapping a gong or inviting the main guest, the guests would proceed in order through the gate into the inner garden, cleanse themselves at the tsukubai, and then approach the tea house door. If a crawl door was present, each guest entered one by one, leaving behind swords and rank, metaphorically stepping from the ordinary into a pure land of harmony. This entire choreography in the garden was unique to the way of tea and was very much formalized by the Edo period. For example, the 17th century Shokokute Meiseki Zue, illustrated guide to famous tea gardens, shows plans with little streams to separate outer and inner roji. Detail meant to further mark the spiritual divide by crossing a bridge into the deeper sanctum. Inside the tea room, the guests would find a continuation of the atmosphere, tatami mats underfoot, perhaps a faint scent of incense, and the gentle hiss of the boiling kettle, an iron kettle hung or set into a sunken hearth, heating the water. Utensils, a tea bowl, chawan, tea caddy, natsume or share, bamboo tea scoop, chashaku, bamboo whisk, chasen, and silk cloths were artfully arranged or brought in by the host in a prescribed order. In Edo times, these implements became highly collectible and cherished. Many daimyo and wealthy merchants vied to obtain famed tea bowls or artisan works, sometimes at great expense, while also valuing simple locally made wares that embodied wabi-sabi. A delicate balance was maintained between appreciating fine art and maintaining humility. Tea records from Edo mention certain bowls or kettles by name and lineage, treated almost like honored guests themselves. Yet the aesthetic ethos reminded participants that, as Rikyu taught, there is shelter enough when the roof doesn't leak, there is food enough when it staves off hunger, to delight in refined splendor belongs to worldly life. This quote from the Nanporoku, an early 18th century record of Rikyu's teachings, was known to tea practitioners. It was a caution that the small, plain tea room is meant to foreground the spiritual essence of the gathering over any worldly luxury. Accordingly, even though some tea gatherings in Edo could be elaborate, with expensive china or sumptuous kaiseki meals, the highest ideal always pointed back to simplicity and genuine hospitality rather than show. Procedure of an Edo-period tea gathering. Tea ceremonies in Edo were generally of two types: the informal gathering, chake-cha-hui, and the formal full gathering, chaji-cha-shi. An informal chakai might last just an hour or two, serving a bowl of thin tea, usucha, and a sweet, perhaps to a larger number of guests, often in an urban setting. The formal chaji, however, was the most esteemed form, a half-day event for a small group, usually 3 to 5 guests, that included a light course meal, kaiseki, a pause, thick tea, koicha served from one bowl shared, and then thin tea and sweets. The full cheiji was a test of endurance and etiquette, but it was deeply appreciated by aficionados as a consummate cultural experience. By Edo times, the procedure itemai for both kinds was meticulously set, though each school had minor variations. A typical formal tea gathering in Edo might proceed as follows. In the early morning or afternoon, guests arrive at the tea house gate. They inspect a waiting area and perhaps are served a cup of hot water or told to relax until all are present. The host then welcomes them silently, and they enter the outer roji as described, moving through to the inner roji and cleansing at the water basin. Entering the tea room, guests first admire the tokonoma scroll and arrangement. In Edo, the scroll was often a Zen phrase or poem appropriate to the season or theme of the gathering, and might have been brushed by a revered calligrapher, perhaps a Zen priest the host admires. They also take note of the kettle and fireplace arrangement. After seating, the host greets everyone with bows, and a light meal is served if it's a chaji. This kaiseki meal in tea context is not the elaborate multi-course banquet of later Japanese dining, but a simpler yet artful course of small dishes emphasizing seasonal ingredients: rice, soup, a few delicacies, followed by a sweet confection. The host might employ fine lacquerware or cherished ceramics for serving, balancing wabi rustic pieces with perhaps one refined piece to delight the guests, as per Shuko's teaching of mixing karamono, Chinese items, with wamono, Japanese items. After the meal, there is usually a break, called nakadachi, where guests return to the waiting bench while the host cleans up and prepares for the tea service proper. During winter, a charcoal fire might be tended to heat the water properly, all done following set forms. Once recalled to the room, the guests partake in koicha, The thick tea. Thick tea is made by kneading a larger quantity of matcha powder with relatively little water, yielding a dense, soup-like consistency that is passed around. Each guest sips from the same bowl, wiping the rim before handing it on. This sharing of one bowl is highly symbolic of unity and intimacy. Conversation during koicha is minimal and respectful, often just compliments on the tea's taste or the bowl's beauty. Afterwards, thin tea, gusucha, is prepared individually for each guest in a lighter, more relaxed segment. Usucha is frothy and bright green, the image often associated with matcha. Throughout all these steps, the etiquette and gestures are prescribed. Guests have their own role. For example, the main guest might ask polite questions about the scroll or the origin of a certain tea container, giving the host a chance to share a story. The last guest has duties like closing the door at entrances. Guests also apologize for drinking before others or for examining utensils, showing constant deference. The host's role is to execute the preparation with grace. They use the long-handled ladle, hishaku, to pour hot water, whisk the tea in a measured rhythm, and present bowls with two hands respectfully. Every movement is intentional, almost like a slow dance. The training to achieve this fluidity took many years. Edo-Period samurai or merchants who took up tea would practice in classrooms set up by tea masters, repeating motions to get them just right. It was said to take years of practice to perform every step with very little mental effort, meaning the host internalizes the ritual so well that it becomes a Zen-like flow. This notion reflects Zen's concept of mushin, no mind, a state where the trained body acts naturally without conscious forcing. In fact, parallels were often drawn between tea and martial arts in that regard. Just as a swordsman drills kata forms until they are second nature, a tea practitioner drills tamai. The difference being that Chanoyu's ultimate aim is peace, not combat, but the dedication to form leading to spiritual freedom is analogous. At the end of a tea gathering, after all have finished their tea, there is a moment for appreciating the utensils, haiken. Guests might be invited to come closer to examine, say, the tea caddy or the tea scoop, which the host places on display. In Edo times, this was an anticipated part of the event, especially if the host had used a famous antique or a creatively crafted item. Guests would handle these with a cloth, never bare hands to show respect and care, and admire their details, perhaps quietly remarking on a beautiful glaze or a fine carving. This appreciation is not materialistic greed. Rather, it's a way of extending respect to the efforts of artisans and the history embodied in the objects, tying into the Zen idea of being fully present and grateful for everything used. A guest might know that a tea bowl was made by the great potter Chojiro, as an example, and feel a deep connection through touch, a moment of communion with the lineage of the art. The host then signals the gathering's close, and the guests depart with bows, possibly stepping back out into the garden path, now seeing it in a new light after the intimate experience. Such a sequence underscores how Chanoyu engaged all the senses, the visual simplicity of the room, the aroma of incense and tea, the warmth of the bowl in hand, the taste of the tea, bitter matcha balanced by sweet wagashi confections, and the sounds, water, kettle, the faint clink of utensils, which are themselves part of the contemplative atmosphere. Many Edo-period writings on tea highlight that it is a discourse in silence or a teaching without words, aligning it squarely with Zen practice. Indeed, a Zen monk visiting a chaji would find the atmosphere not unlike a well-conducted Zen meditation retreat, just with the inclusion of delicious tea and artful objects as media for mindfulness. Tea in samurai and townsman life. We have touched on how samurai embraced tea for discipline and diplomacy. It reached the point that by mid-Edo, a cultivated samurai was expected to know the basics of Chanoyu, alongside other arts like poetry or calligraphy. Domain schools sometimes included tea training for young samurai. Lords would host tea gatherings for their retainers to solidify loyalty or celebrate occasions. Sometimes these had political overtones, for example, subtly demonstrating the lord's sophistication or control. The Oche culture source notes that Chanoyu became very important social and political opportunities for daimyo, and some samurai themselves became renowned tea masters. For instance, Matsudaira Fumai, 1751 to 1818, a daimyo of Matsue, was famous for his deep study of tea ceremony. He created a new school, Fumai Ryu, collected hundreds of fine tea utensils, and wrote treatises on the art. Such figures show that tea had high prestige and personal appeal to the warrior elite, even in a time of no war. It was considered a noble pursuit that tempered the warrior's spirit with aesthetic sensitivity and peaceful ritual. In a society where overt displays of aggression were no longer needed, the samurai repurposed their focus into mastering peaceful arts like tea, thereby cultivating an inner strength and calm. Some commentators even linked tea philosophy to Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasizing aspects like self-discipline, honor, purity of intention, and an acceptance of mortality. The fleeting moment in tea can be a metaphor for life's transience. For the merchant class and townsfolk, tea ceremony also became increasingly accessible in Edo. Initially, as mentioned, Chanoyu was an elite affair, but over the 17th and 18th centuries, wealthy merchants began to sponsor their own tea gatherings and to learn under tea masters, often retired samurai, or the Sen schools in Kyoto. In big cities, there emerged a bit of a tea boom where even commoners could attend public tea gatherings held at temples or participate in clubs devoted to practicing tea etiquette. Additionally, a new tea culture of sencha, leaf-brewed green tea, arose among the literati in the 18th century. Different from matcha, sencha do was inspired by Chinese Ming Dynasty practices. It involved steeping whole tea leaves, often of high quality, in a pot and pouring into cups. Sencha was popularized by figures like the monk Bai Sao, 1675 to 1763, who dressed as a humble seller, would serve sencha in Kyoto, extolling a more informal, intellectual tea practice. While sencha do was not the same as Chanoyu, and was not overtly tied to Zen in the way matcha was, it did carry a meditative, scholarly vibe and appealed to townsfolk and scholars. The spread of sencha meant that by late Edo, enjoyment of tea as a mindful activity was not confined to the elite or to formal tea rooms. It was a parallel stream. Chanoyu remained the high art with Zen and wabi aesthetics at its core, while sencha offered a more free-form, Chinese-inspired tea enjoyment that sometimes included reading poetry or admiring Chinese paintings. Both, however, contributed to the idea that tea is more than a drink. It is a cultural ritual that enriches the spirit. It's worth noting, too, the role of women in Edo-period tea culture. Traditionally, tea masters and practitioners had been male, monks, samurai, or merchants. In the Edo period, women of samurai families did practice the arts, but their participation in formal Chanoyu was limited. However, towards the end of Edo and into the subsequent Meiji era, the tea ceremony increasingly became part of women's education, seen as a genteel accomplishment for ladies. This shift was in its early stages during late Edo, with some women from merchant families learning tea, and it expanded greatly after the Edo period ended. By the twilight of Edo, one could occasionally find female tea instructors and more women attending gatherings, especially in merchant circles or in geisha communities where tea skills were part of a geisha's repertoire. This is a reminder that the tea ceremony as a cultural heritage was gradually democratizing, even if its highest echelons were still dominated by the established male Iamotos. In summary, the tea ceremony in Edo-period Japan stood as a pillar of cultural life, encapsulating the era's pursuit of refinement, harmony, and inner peace. It was an art that anyone with dedication, warlord or merchant, monk or layperson, could pursue to better themselves. Tea gatherings created a micro-world governed by kindness, beauty, and mindfulness, temporarily suspending the worries and barriers of ordinary life. Each ceremony, transient by nature, lived only in the memories of host and guests. Yet the accumulated tradition of thousands upon thousands of such moments over the Edo centuries built a legacy that persists in Japan today. To truly appreciate that legacy, it helps to understand the philosophical values that underlie it, values often shared with the Zen garden tradition. We now turn to those shared aesthetic and philosophical principles, particularly wabi-sabi, nature reverence, and mindfulness, to see how Zen gardens and the way of tea converge in purpose and spirit. Shared aesthetics and philosophy, wabi-sabi, nature, and mindfulness. Zen gardens and the tea ceremony are distinct arts, but in Edo, Japan, they were seen as complementary expressions of a unified worldview. Both were deeply informed by the Zen-influenced aesthetic of wabi-sabi and a reverence for nature's simplicity. Both created environments where mindfulness and spiritual insight could arise from seemingly ordinary actions, be it raking gravel or sharing tea. This section explores the common themes that bind the stone garden and the tea room, revealing why they are so often mentioned in the same breath as emblematic of Japanese Zen culture. Wabi-sabi, the beauty of imperfection and impermanence. We have introduced wabi-sabi in earlier sections, but it's worth delving deeper as it is the philosophical aesthetic at the heart of both gardens and tea. In the context of Edo period arts, wabi connoted a rustic, austere beauty, the kind found in a weathered garden gate, a misshapen tea bowl, or a solitary wildflower in a simple vase. Sabi suggested the mellowness of age, the patina of years on an object or place, evoking a sense of melancholic longing and appreciation for the passage of time. Together, wabi-sabi represented a rejection of elaborate luxury in favor of humble authenticity. In a Zen garden, wabi-sabi was evident in the use of old lichen-covered stones, the moss that naturally grew in the shaded corners, and the overall patina of the garden materials. Nothing in such a garden was garishly new or polished. If a stone lantern acquired chips or discoloration over decades, that only increased its charm. Gardens were often designed to look as if they were a timeless piece of nature, not freshly installed, but as if they had always been there. For example, the earthen walls around a temple garden were intentionally kept a dull, irregular finish with subtle stains, blending into the environment rather than standing out. An Edo guide to garden aesthetics might note that, in the beauty of a stone or moss, one sees the silent work of years, reflecting a sabi appreciation. The arrangement of elements in a karasansui also often aimed to create a sense of graceful aging. The stones might be placed to appear half buried, as if they had jutted out of the ground naturally over eons. Gravel patterns might be raked and then partially disturbed by wind or the fall of a leaf, showing the interface of human order and natural happenstance. The gardens were pruned and maintained, of course, but always with an eye to preserving a natural look, avoiding over-manicuring. A famous teaching in this regard is the story of a gardener, sometimes said to be Rikyu or his son, meticulously cleaning the garden path of fallen leaves, then shaking a tree to let a few leaves scatter, achieving the perfect, spontaneous touch. This anecdote, though possibly apocryphal, encapsulates wabi-sabi. The art lies in slight imperfection and asymmetry, which feel more alive and truthful than sterile perfection. In the tea ceremony, wabi-sabi was embodied in the tea room's atmosphere and the utensils used. Sen no Rikyu's preference for rustic wares set the template. He cherished simple Korean rice bowls as tea bowls, seeing unpretentious warmth in them, or locally made unglazed jars for water that had earthy textures. The Edo tea masters continued this preference. A slightly cracked but well-repaired the tea bowl, using the art of kintsugi, golden joinery, could become even more valued for its flaw turned into beauty, a perfect example of sabi. The tea gardens, roji, too exuded wabi-sabi, stepping stones irregular, covered in dew, a bamboo spout gently dripping water into the basin, the overall sense of an archaic retreat in the city. Tea people in Edo collected sayings and poems that praised these qualities. One such famous Zen phrase, inscribed on hanging scrolls, was, "The moon is not pleasing unless partly obscured by a cloud." This line encapsulates the wabi-sabi idea that something is most beautiful when not fully revealed or when slightly incomplete. Tea gatherings often took place in the early evening or dawn when light was dim, or in autumn when things were fading, seasons and times that naturally align with wabi-sabi feelings. In conversation, a tea host might purposely avoid showing all his best utensils at once, instead, maybe including one or two treasured items among more common ones to keep the atmosphere unassuming. If the hanging scroll was an old faded piece of calligraphy that lent a sense of antiquity and depth, the guests attuned to these values would feel a poignant sense of beauty that was at once profound and tinged with the awareness of ephemerality, the gathering itself being fleeting, the season turning, etc. Nature and the seasons. Both Zen gardens and tea ceremony operate in sync with nature and its changes. In a Karasansui garden, although it may not have colorful flowers, the shift of seasons is marked by subtle means. The angle of sunlight and shadows over the gravel, the moss going lush green in the rainy season or dry in a drought, maybe a maple tree beyond the wall turning red and dropping a leaf onto the sand. Monks and garden keepers would sometimes allow or even place a seasonal accent in the garden. For instance, a camellia bloom might fall on the moss in winter, or a few bamboo leaves scatter in the wind. These little seasonal signatures were appreciated. In Edo times, travel diaries and art often celebrated the famous snow, moon, and flowers trio, Yuki, Tsuki, Hana, as quintessential beauties of nature. A Zen garden under snow becomes an almost entirely abstract white canvas, stones poking out like dark islands in a sea of purity. Under the moonlight, the pale gravel might glow softly, giving an ethereal vibe. Though gardens were usually viewed in daytime, the Zen aesthetic often references the poetic potential of night and weather, something a resident monk would certainly experience living on temple grounds year-round. The garden in rain, for example, has its own life, raindrops dimpling the sand, wet stones shining. All this tied into the Zen appreciation of nature as a teacher of impermanence and as a mirror of the mind's state. A clear moon in an empty sky being a metaphor for enlightened mind in Zen poetry, for example. In the tea ceremony, seasonality was paramount. Every aspect of a tea gathering was coordinated to reflect the current season or weather, to attune participants to the here and now, which is essentially a mindfulness practice. Edo-period tea guides emphasized that the host should change the utensils and decor according to season. In a summer gathering, one might use a shallow, cooler-feeling tea bowl and have more open ventilation in the tea room, perhaps hanging a scroll of bamboo stirring in wind. In winter, the hearth is opened in the tatami floor for warmth. Tea bowls might be heavier or even intentionally rough to give a warm, rustic feeling, and the garden may feature a straw mat over certain plants to protect them from frost. A common sight in winter tea gardens, as shown even in a photo of an old geisha house garden with trees wrapped for snow. Flowers arranged in the alcove were always those in bloom. That day or about to bloom, Chabana, tea flowers, has its own art of looking spontaneous and natural, typically just one or two sprigs in a simple vase, unlike the more formal ikebana. If the gathering was in autumn, the host might place a single reddening maple leaf on the pathway, or choose a tea scoop carved from a piece of wood with a motif of geese in flight. These touches were not just decoration, they were gentle reminders to savor the transient moment, in line with Zen and Buddhist teachings of impermanence, mujo. A common sentiment was that the Ichigo Ichie principle, one time, one meeting, is tied to seasonality. This exact gathering, on this particular autumn day of this year, will never come again. Therefore, it must be treasured now. Guests were keenly aware of these nuances, and often later wrote haiku or couplets inspired by the sensory details arranged by the host. For example, the sight of a moon-viewing themed wagashi suite and the distant sound of an insect outside might inspire a verse about the loneliness of autumn, directly experiencing what Zen calls suchness of the moment. Mindfulness and spirituality. At their core, both the Zen garden and tea ceremony function as vehicles for mindfulness, a full engagement of the present moment with an open, calm mind. We have described how monks meditated on garden scenes and how tea participants focus on each ritual act. What's striking is how both practices make the ordinary into extraordinary through mindful attention. Sweeping the garden path can be a mundane chore, but in a Zen context, it is an act of purification and concentration. Similarly, making a bowl of tea could be trivial refreshment, but in Chanoyu it is elevated to a sacred exchange. The spirituality in both is nonverbal and subtle. There are no sermons given in a garden or a tea room, yet lessons abound. One can consider the Zen concept of oneness or non-duality, the idea that the observer and the observed are not truly separate. In a Zen garden, as one contemplates the arrangement, there's an opportunity to lose the sense of self and merge with the stillness of the scene. Many Zen practitioners have reported moments of clarity while sitting by a rock garden where the boundary between I and garden fades, and there's just awareness. The simplicity of the environment, free of distractions, helps allow this unity to be felt. Likewise, in a deeply engrossing tea ceremony, host and guests may fall into a synchronized rhythm of courteous actions and gratitude, creating a harmonious field of awareness. The formal phrases uttered, osakini, when drinking before others, or oteme chodai itashimasu, to thank for the tea, become like mantras focusing everyone on respect and the present. In an ideal Edo tea gathering, conversation would diminish as the tea is served, leading to a poignant silence where, perhaps while the last guest drinks their bowl, all simply appreciate the shared silence, a silence charged with friendship and presence. This resembles group meditation, in effect. The 18th century tea master Sotan, Rikyu's grandson, even said explicitly that the small room tea is about attaining realization in accord with the Buddhist path and not about worldly delights. Such statements underline the view of Chanoyu as a spiritual practice as much as an art. Furthermore, both arts teach detachment through attachment. Participants invest care and love into designing a garden or conducting a tea ceremony, yet they must also be prepared to let things go. A sudden gust might disturb the perfect sand patterns in a garden or blow out a lantern. A treasured tea bowl might get accidentally chipped during use. The philosophy of wabi-sabi and Zen combined tells one to accept these things. Rikyu's own life story, where he had to give up his position and life at the whim of Hideyoshi despite achieving the highest mastery of tea, is often cited as a lesson in the impermanence of all art and accomplishment. Edo tea masters thus often kept a sober mindset. Enjoy the beauty fully, but do not cling to it. Similarly, in tending a garden, one might realize that no matter how one arranges it, nature will have the final say. Moss will grow as it wills. Seasons will change the scene. This encourages humility and letting go of ego, fundamental aims of Zen cultivation. Harmony of the two arts. It is no accident that tea houses were typically surrounded by Zen-style gardens. The synergy was deliberate. Before a tea ceremony, guests walk through the Roji garden to shed their mental burdens. After the ceremony, they often walk back out through the garden in a reflective mood. The garden thus bookends the experience, amplifying its effect. Some of the great tea masters of Edo were also garden designers. We saw Enshu designing gardens for his tea venues, highlighting that the sensibilities overlapped. In effect, the garden was an extension of the tea room, the outer meditation space versus the inner one. Tea instructions from the Edo period admonish the host to ensure the path is moist, watered to lay dust, the greenery well trimmed but natural, and to create an atmosphere of seijaku, quiet solitude, in the roji. One manual says the roji should feel like a mountain trail to a hermit's hut, even if in the middle of a city. This shows the conscious creation of a liminal space that psychologically prepares participants for the sacred tea ritual. Conversely, a Zen monk might use the metaphor of a tea gathering to instruct about life. Consider each day as a tea gathering. It won't come again, so pay attention. An imagined Zen saying that encapsulates Ichigo Ichi attitude. Indeed, Zen literature and tea literature often intersect. The Zencharoku, Record of Zen Tea, a text from around the Edo period, explicitly talks about how the spirit of Zen and tea are one, and how the four tea principles, harmony, respect, purity, tranquility, correspond to Buddhist virtues. Quiet refinement, shibui, and mystery, yugen. Two additional aesthetic concepts worth noting that both arts share are shibui and yugen. Shibui refers to a kind of understated, astringent elegance. Something shibui is attractive in a low-key way, with depth that might not be immediately obvious. A weathered wood pillar in a tea room or a gray stone in a garden can be shibui, not calling attention, but deeply satisfying upon longer contemplation. Edo connoisseurs of tea and gardens often praised things for their shibui quality, meaning it had an unassuming excellence. Yugen, on the other hand, is often translated as mysterious profundity. It implies that a work of art or scene does not reveal all its meanings at once. There's an ineffable aspect that invites imagination. A Zen garden's abstraction is yugen. One might stare at a simple arrangement of rocks and feel a profound presence or story that cannot be fully explained. In tea, a moment of yugen might occur if, say during a gathering, an unexpected breeze causes the charcoal in the hearth to glow, or a bell to ring softly in a distant temple, a fleeting detail that evokes deep emotion beyond words. Edo-period arts celebrated yugen especially in no theater and poetry, but it was equally valued in the mute arts of tea and garden. The best experiences were those that left participants with a lingering sense of mystery and longing, as if they touched something beyond the ordinary. This relates again to Zen enlightenment experiences, which are said to be inexpressible in words. In conclusion of this section, the Zen garden and the tea ceremony were two paths up the same mountain. Both lead the practitioner or participant towards a state of heightened awareness, appreciation of imperfection, and alignment with the rhythms of nature. In Edo Japan, they were not esoteric rarities, but integrated parts of cultural life, teaching generations the art of living mindfully. One could say that through tending gardens and practicing tea, the people of Edo cultivated their inner gardens and steeped their souls in a calming brew of wisdom. The calm, reflective tone that pervaded these practices was a balm in a structured society, a reminder that beyond the ranks and duties, there was a universal human quest for peace and truth, which could be glimpsed in a raked pattern of sand or the sound of tea whisked in a bowl. Cultural significance and legacy in Edo society. Having explored the technical and philosophical aspects of Zen gardens and tea ceremony, it is important to contextualize their broader cultural significance in Edo-period society and consider their enduring legacy. These practices were more than artistic hobbies. They were integral to the social fabric and value system of the time. They provided a common language of civility and aesthetics across different classes, and their influence extended into literature, art, and daily manners. In Edo society, engaging in the tea ceremony or maintaining a refined garden was a sign of education and good breeding. For the samurai, proficiency in Chanoyu demonstrated that one had the proper upbringing and discipline. It showed one could appreciate subtlety and behaved with decorum, qualities expected in a peacetime bureaucracy of the Tokugawa era. In fact, some domains, Han, encouraged their samurai to practice tea as part of their training. There are records of clan lords hosting annual tea events for vassals, or even exams where a samurai had to perform a tea procedure to be considered for promotion, as it reflected on his temperament. This intertwining of tea with the way of the warrior, Bushido ethos, gave Chanoyu a masculine, rigorous reputation alongside its artistic side. A true warrior was supposed to be as composed pouring tea as he would be in battle, an ideal of serene imperturbability. Some have pointed out that the focus and rhythm learned in tea could even aid in combat by training one's breathing and awareness. There's a famous connection of Zen, tea, and swordsmanship through masters like Yagyu Munenori and Zen monk Takuan Soho, though that goes beyond Edo into philosophy of martial arts. For townspeople and the rising merchant class, tea ceremony and small inner gardens became a way to aspire to the cultured lifestyle of the elite. Since merchants were often wealthier than cash-strapped samurai, they could afford to patronize arts generously. By the late Edo period, 18th to 19th centuries, cities like Osaka, Kyoto, and Edo had thriving circles of merchant tea enthusiasts. Some floated between commerce and art. For instance, oil and rice merchants in Osaka might host poetry and tea sessions in evenings, blurring class lines somewhat in those private spheres. The concept of the floating world, ukiyo, known from the pleasure quarters, influenced even teas. There were tea houses in the geisha districts where one could enjoy a light version of Chanoyu demonstration along with entertainment. While purists might have disdained that as play acting, it nonetheless spread familiarity of tea ceremony conventions to a wider populace. The small gardens, tsubaniwa, in townhouses, as mentioned, were tangible evidence that even a shopkeeper valued a corner of tranquility and natural beauty. Guidebooks in Edo gave tips on arranging these, often borrowing from tea garden principles. It wasn't just the rich. Even a small sweet shop might have a tiny courtyard with a lantern and plantain tree glimpsed by customers, signifying a taste for elegance. This democratization of Zen aesthetic sensibility is a hallmark of the Edo period. Aesthetic pleasure and mindful moments were not solely the province of monks or lords, but something many could partake in at some level. Art and literature, Zen gardens, and tea ceremony also influenced other art forms. Many Edo-era painters, especially those of the literati Bunjin school, painted idealized landscapes reminiscent of Zen gardens, sparse imagery like a few rocks and some mist, suggestive and open to interpretation. This was partly due to Chinese Zen, Chan ink painting influence, but reinforced by living with Zen gardens. Some artists like Sesshu, a bit earlier, Muromachi period, and later Maruyama Okyo, or ikinotaiga in Edo-Period, depicted famous gardens or tea gatherings in their work. Poems, haiku, and renga frequently used tea or garden imagery as seasonal references or metaphors. For example, Matsuo Basho, the great haiku poet, 1644 to 1694, was deeply influenced by Zen and wabi-sabi. His poetry often evokes the same quiet poignancy one finds in a garden at dusk or a solitary tea moment. One of his famous haiku, Sabi e ike, Chanoyu nagara, mushi no koi, entering the tranquility skills, just like in a tea ceremony. Sound of insects, although not literal, encapsulates, merging tea-like tranquility with a natural setting of insect sounds, illustrating the cross-pollination of these sensibilities. There were also entire texts dedicated to praising tea and gardens. The illustrated manual of renowned tea gardens, Shokoku Chate Meisekizue, compiled in late Tokugawa period, as cited earlier, indicates how tea gardens were cataloged and celebrated. And Nanporoku, attributed to Rikyu's teachings but circulated later, was studied by Edo tea aficionados as a source of profound insight, almost like scripture blending Zen and tea wisdom. In it and similar writings, the tea room is likened to a hermitage, tea ceremony to a spiritual pilgrimage, spiritual and moral education. Beyond aesthetics, these practices played a subtle role in moral education. Confucian ethics was the official ideology of Edo, emphasizing loyalty, filial piety, etc. However, the lived morality of many included the cultivation of personal virtue through arts. This was called mitates, seeing moral lessons in artistic practice. For instance, cleaning the tea space thoroughly was seen as fostering sincerity and diligence. Treating guests with utmost courtesy in a tea gathering reinforced empathy and respect in other dealings. The rule that the first guest should be the most honored and sits closest to the scroll taught recognition of merit and seniority. Meanwhile, all guests bowing equally taught humility. The samurai's tea, bukecha, schools even formalized some differences, like allowing certain assertiveness appropriate to warriors. But still, the overarching message was one of tempering aggression with civility. The existence of these warrior tea schools shows how integral it was to align the practice with the class's identity. They framed it as another kind of dojo, or training hall for the mind. Political symbolism. There were moments when tea and gardens intersected directly with political events. A notable anecdote. In the early Edo era, the shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu conducted a grand tea ceremony where he had numerous daimyo lords in attendance. By making them sit together peacefully in a small room, sharing tea, it sent a message of unified loyalty under his rule. Some accounts mention Iemitsu using tea gatherings to keep the possibly rebellious lords in check, a demonstration of cultural power, if not military. He even had a cherished tea kettle called hiragumo, flat spider, that became legendary. Possessing such famous utensils was a bit like possessing regalia. The concept of the shogun's tea jar procession, mentioned in Search Results 31, highlights how a mere object related to tea could be imbued with state ceremony. Annually, a formal procession carried the shogunate's tea supply from Uji, the tea-growing region, to Edo, treated with the importance of a ritual. This was, in effect, using tea as a symbol of the regime's legitimacy and ties to the land's fertility, urbanization, and tranquility. Edo grew to be one of the largest cities in the world by 1700s, with perhaps 1 million inhabitants. In such a densely populated, often noisy environment, the presence of small oases of calm was deeply valued. We've mentioned Suboniwa. Additionally, temple gardens, including Zen ones, in cities offered public visiting on certain days. The ordinary townsman might not practice tea ceremony formally, but could still stroll the grounds of Asakusa's Sensoji or a sub-temple in Ueno and find a measure of peace among the greenery and gravel. This foreseeably had a beneficial effect on the urban psyche, providing a pressure release from the rigidities of a hierarchical society. Legacy beyond Edo. As the Edo period ended with the Meiji Restoration in 1868, many feared that traditional arts like tea ceremony and garden design might decline amid rapid westernization. Indeed, the samurai class was abolished, and some support for these arts waned initially. But, interestingly, what happened was a revival and repackaging of them as national heritage. The tea schools survived by adapting. They increasingly taught women, since samurai men were no more, women of the emerging middle class took interest as part of being accomplished. Tea ceremony came to be seen as a hallmark of Japanese culture, something to showcase to foreign dignitaries. The Zen gardens of places like Ryoanji became tourist attractions as Japan opened up, astonishing Western visitors with their minimalist beauty. They influenced Western art and architecture. For example, the abstract art movement and modernist architects in the 20th century drew inspiration from Zen gardens. Thinkers like Okakura Kakuzo wrote the Book of Tea in English 1906 to explain the profound philosophy of Chanoyu to the world, linking it explicitly to Zen and the essence of Japanese spirit. In it, he famously says, "Teaism is a cult founded on the adoration of the beautiful among the sordid facts of everyday existence." This beautifully sums up what Edo people had long practiced, finding the beautiful and spiritual in the everyday act of drinking tea. Garden-wise, the Edo strolling gardens remain as public parks, Kenroku-en, Koraku-en, etc., while the quiet Zen gardens continue to inspire many modern gardeners and landscape designers around the world to create Zen-inspired spaces for meditation. Terms like Zen garden entered common language globally as a synonym for a peaceful retreat, even if sometimes misapplied. The legacy in Japan is also very tangible. Many Japanese today study tea ceremony as an extracurricular activity or in college clubs, keeping the lineage alive. Zen temples still maintain their gardens, and some companies even encourage employees to experience tea ceremony or garden visits for stress relief and to learn focus. The spirit of Ichigo-ichi is invoked in business and hospitality circles to emphasize sincerity in each encounter. In popular culture, one finds countless references or scenes of tea ceremony and gardens, from novels to films, symbolizing depth, tradition, or emotional pause. For example, a movie might depict a character rediscovering their cultural roots by learning tea or by raking a family temple's rock garden. These arts serve as a shorthand for Japanese spirituality and aesthetics in the modern imagination. That continuity is a direct result of the robust foundation laid in the Edo period, when these practices were codified, widely taught, and lovingly preserved. Conclusion. In the calm enclave of a Zen garden or the hushed intimacy of a tea room, the people of Edo-Period Japan found a mirror for their highest ideals. The dry gardens of Zen temples and the tea ceremonies in rustic chashitsu both cultivated an appreciation for simplicity, transience, and mindful presence that transcended the ordinary routines of life. Within their earthen walls, time seemed to slow. Raked gravel suggested the timeless flow of water. The whisking of tea became the sound of wind in the pines. We have seen how these two arts, one of stone and sand, the other of tea and hospitality, were interwoven threads in the cultural fabric of Edo, Japan. They were nourished by Zen Buddhist philosophy and by the aesthetics of wabi and sabi, which together taught that beauty lies in restraint and the natural cycle of growth and decay. In an era defined by social order and ritual, the Zen garden and tea ceremony provided structured yet liberating experiences. Their rituals were choreographed to lead participants toward inner stillness and a gentle awareness of each fleeting moment. A daimyo might leave the pressures of governance to perform a tea gathering, carefully arranging each element in pursuit of the perfect ambiance of harmony and respect. A monk might step into his courtyard garden at dawn, finding enlightenment in the pattern of shadows on white sand. The enduring power of Edo's Zen gardens and Chanoyu lies in their ability to make the profound from the simplest of materials and actions. Pebbles, rocks, and moss, nothing could be more humble, yet arranged with care they become a cosmos in miniature, inviting contemplation of the infinite, water, tea leaves, a fire, elemental things, yet in the tea ceremony they become a sacrament of friendship and mindfulness. These arts elevated the act of seeing and the act of serving into spiritual exercises. They remind us that, as the Zen saying goes, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The enlightenment sought by Edo practitioners was not apart from daily life, but deeply embedded in it, found in the exacting sweep of a broom along a stone path, or in the silent bow exchanged over a tea bowl. Edo-Period Japan eventually gave way to modernity, but the tranquil spirit fostered by these practices did not disappear. It continued to flow like an underground stream, emerging in new forms and continuing to inspire. Today, a visitor to an old temple in Kyoto can sit on the veranda of a Zen garden and feel the same gentle awe that an Edo pilgrim might have felt centuries ago. Likewise, attending a tea ceremony, even in a modern tea room, can transport one to a realm of calm focus, as if the bustle outside has been momentarily suspended. These experiences testify to the timelessness of the values cultivated by Zen gardens and tea. They are a legacy not just of art, but of wisdom, a wordless teaching transmitted from one generation to the next. In reflecting on Edo-Period Zen gardens and the way of tea, one is ultimately struck by a sense of balance they brought to a complex society. They balanced discipline with grace, solitude with community, and artifice with nature. They provided a sanctuary for the soul in an age of regimented life, and in their quiet, unassuming way, they carried forward a message that resonates. Even now, peace can be found in the present moment, and sometimes all it takes is to arrange a few stones in a pattern or to share a bowl of tea with an open heart. Each stone, each sip, each breath, all are portals to the meditative awareness that Zen strives for. The Edo period nurtured these portals, leaving future generations a path, quite literally a stone path through dew, to step into a calmer, more reflective state of being. As we conclude this exploration, it is fitting to recall the principle of Ichigo Ichi, one time, one meeting, so cherished in tea culture. Every encounter with a garden, with a cup of tea with a friend, is unique and unrepeatable. The Zen gardens and tea ceremonies of Edo, Japan were, and are, exquisite stage sets for such encounters. In their calm and meditative spaces, one learns to cherish the unrepeatable now. This gentle lesson may well be the greatest gift passed down from the gardeners and tea masters of the Edo period. Irisinsis continues to invite us across centuries to pause and savor the profound serenity that lies just beyond the rush of everyday life, as accessible as a stone and as simple as a bowl of tea.